One big concept that you see really all throughout world geography and world cultures, but we really in particular need to understand for this region, Central America and the Caribbean, is the idea of cultural diffusion. And cultural diffusion is the spread of cultural beliefs and social activities from one group to another. You're basically taking culture from one area, moving it, spreading it into a new area, to a new group of people. And over time, the mixing of world cultures throughout different groups of people, different ethnicities, different nationalities, religions, it's really picked up in speed. It's increased as communication, transportation, and technology have advanced. It's made it easier for culture to diffuse throughout the world. So, what makes this happen? Some of this we already referenced before: transportation, trade, communication. Think about it 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, transportation was at a point where people were not able to move around the world very easily. Trade was happening in much more local areas. Communication was happening basically with whoever you could talk to in person. If you think about where we are at today in the 21st century, with the internet, with airplanes being able to get you from one side of the world to another in a day, with goods being shipped around the world constantly, culture is able to be diffused so much quicker. Considering Central America and the Caribbean, oceans are definitely going to come into play. Indigenous peoples were living with their own cultures for a long time until Europeans crossed those oceans and brought their culture to diffuse. Until Africans were brought through the slave trade and brought their elements of culture. The ocean was a barrier until people started crossing it. So, beyond culture, other diffusion happened as well. I apologize for the graininess of this image, but I want to mention something called the Columbian Exchange. This name comes from Christopher Columbus, and it basically started a huge exchange of goods across those oceans. As Europeans are arriving in the Americas, not just Columbus here, but the Spanish in Central America, even when the British and French came into North America, all of these things that they discover that are native to the Americas, they brought those back to Europe for the first time. So you have a huge exchange of goods happening. But I want to point out the cultural changes that were going to occur. That's what we're going to focus on most. This is a map of present day Central America, but all of these indigenous groups are marked off. This is where each one of these indigenous groups would have been living. This would have been their territory marked off. Some of the areas, especially towards Guatemala and Costa Rica, you see just huge clusters of so many different groups. All of them would have had their own culture. All of them would have had their own lifestyle, and they're already here. Thousands of years ago, these are the people that are already living there, the indigenous people, original people. Now we're going to look at the huge cultural diffusion that occurs with European colonization. Spain and Portugal come to the Americas. We've got some years marked here, but basically throughout the late 1400s into the mid 1600s, a lot of this brown area, especially, taken over by the Spanish. What happens when Spain comes? Well, they spread their culture. Some of the main goals of them creating colonies in the first place was to convert people to their own religion. It's no surprise that today Roman Catholicism is the major religion in this area. It was culturally diffused by the Europeans that were there. But the Europeans weren't the only group. Like we mentioned before, they were setting up plantations. They wanted to grow a lot of those crops in the tropics, and they needed a labor source. And sadly, this is where people of African ancestry came. They were loaded up on slave ships against their will, brought over to the Caribbean and Central America, and they brought their culture with them too. So once all of these different groups of people get together, we've got a whole different situation when it comes to essentially brand new groups of people being created. there is a racial mixture that happened here. And I don't need to get too into the health class aspect and the biology aspect for you to figure out how that happened. But essentially, when Europeans and Africans and natives were all in the same area, eventually you end up with people that are offspring of Spaniards that are born in the Americas, people that are mixed European and native ancestry, people that are mixed European and African ancestry, people that are mixed native and African ancestry, all these different groups. And it turned into essentially a hierarchy, a power structure, where if you belonged to one group, you were seen as better than the others, more rights than the others. Notice how this is structured. Europeans at the top. If you were a Spaniard, you were on top of the pyramid, all the way down to the indigenous people, and finally the Africans. Which class you were born into essentially determines what level of rights you're going to face, what kind of taxes you're going to pay, how you're going to be viewed by the people around you. So cultural diffusion set up this system where basically you were born into a rung in a class structure, and that's what you had to deal with for the rest of your life. If we fast forward to present day, it's not all bad. It started off in a very negative sense when we saw basically the division of people based on race and having different rights and people being treated terribly the further down you were on the pyramid. Today, though, this has created an incredibly diverse culture in places like the Caribbean and Central America. The idea of a melting pot is something that we think about when we have cultural diffusion in large amounts, and a lot of different cultures come together to create one huge blended, mixed up new culture. This is sort of what happens here. We've got a lot of different groups that we've seen come into the area over time, and all of that gets mixed together. And what we end up with is really a beautiful combination of elements of all of these cultures. You see it in food, you see it in music, you see it in clothing. So cultural diffusion today has given a very unique and distinct culture to the area, but remembering where that came from, it's got elements of the indigenous people, it's got elements of European culture, it's got elements of African ancestry. Cultural diffusion has really shaped the region today. Hopefully you understand a little bit better how that all came to be with the different groups coming in and bringing those cultures. But that's it for now.